The Incident of the Chemical Reaction. Part 5. When I awoke in the morning, there was Ezra at the small table eating breakfast and looking dirty and bedraggled. He still wore the same clothes from the day before. "Good morning," he said chipperly. "Where did you get breakfast? Have you slept at all? Where have you been?" I asked all at once. "Breakfast was delivered. I had it arranged last night, as I knew we would be having an early morning. Yours is there." And he motioned to a covered dish opposite him. "I have slept some, though not here. Some on a bench outside the diner, some in a car outside the apartment of Dr. Blanchard. Some in a very uncomfortable chair at the facility, which also tells you where I have been." Moving to the chair before my breakfast, I asked eagerly, "And what have you found out?" "I have worked long and hard, John, and now that I may have the answer, I am still willing to wait just a little bit longer until I am certain." Disappointed at this response, I began eating. "Well," I said after a couple of bites, "when will you know?" "Shortly, my dear John, shortly. It would be ideal for Mr. Hunter if I were to know before the demonstration, which you may remember is in no less than 2 hours. But if not until later, fine. I have no horse in this race." I checked the time and felt suddenly very hurried. It was a little after 6, the demo was at 8. I tried to figure out how far we were from the facility. Somehow, reading my thoughts, Ezra said, "About 25 minutes, at least that is what it was last night with no traffic." Then he wiped his mouth and announced, "I will shower first while you eat. I thank you for bringing up my bag, John." "I thank you for ordering breakfast, Ezra," I responded, mimicking his odd phrasing. Nothing more did I get from Ezra while in the room or in the car on our way to the facility. The sun had long been up, and the morning bright and growing hot when we stepped from the car to the entrance of Naptu. I couldn't help my mind wondering all the time, had Ezra actually figured something out? What were we doing here? We were just 2 guys from Boston who happened to be acquainted with the son of one of the main investors. Wouldn't we look like fools and be tossed out if Ezra said something ridiculous? Ezra, however, appeared completely relaxed and unconcerned, as though he had been at Naptu for years and belonged there entirely, walking rapidly through the security check with a flick of his pass and onto the elevators. I followed at his heel as he turned rapidly here and there. A few minutes after 8, I was trailing behind Ezra down a short hall when he turned and knocked upon a glass door. As I came up to him, I saw through the opening door and across the table Mr. Hunter. He nodded to us as we stepped inside the room. A standard meeting room, the great table, the serious, wealthy-looking people encircling it. For a moment, all eyes looked to us, but then with a nod from Ezra to Mr. Hunter, the older man said, "Please continue." Dr. Vishwakarma was at the head of the room, with a large display running through technical information on T112, current restraints and expectations after a couple more months of fine-tuning, application requirements, and again hopes for improvement. A video played showing a piece of glass in a filthy tank with a 1-month time-lapse overlaid on the image. The glass was lifted out of the water and shown to be absolutely pristine. "As you can see," Dr. Vishwakarma was saying, "even in the most ideal conditions for the growth of a variety of sea scum, nothing has been able to adhere to the glass." There was a general sense of the viewers being impressed. "We have, of course, resubmerged the piece, and will continue to test for the prescribed 1 year for mineral formations as well as plant and life growth." He then moved to a table which held 2 clear vials and a bit of glass. After donning safety goggles and asking the others in the room to do the same, he reached for one of the vials. I watched nervously as he poured the components together and wondered what steps had been taken in case of a fire. But nothing happened, and once thoroughly mixed, he casually spread the compound smoothly onto the glass. He talked about workability and dry times, pressure and heat, restrictions and limitations, longevity, and so on. The demonstration over, the group seemed pleased, and Dr. Vishwakarma looked with questioning at some of the people in the room, including Mr. Hunter. He nodded and said, "Go ahead, Dr. Vishwakarma. Tell them what happened." "To be utterly transparent," Dr. Vishwakarma began, "there was an incident on Sunday with our testing. A mixture reacted volatilely, and our lead scientist, Dr. Blanchard, did receive some very slight chemical burns. It was a one-off incident, and I am completely confident in this product's safety and efficacy." "Have you identified the cause?" one of the men asked. No," Dr. Vishwakarma answered. "Unfortunately, not yet. But again, I am 100% confident in this mixture." And he waved his hand toward the sample on the table. "Was it a different mixture that had the reaction?" the man pressed. Dr. Vishwakarma cleared his throat. "No, it was the same mixture." "You are trying to sell us a coating that sometimes explodes," was the dry response. I pitied Dr. Vishwakarma in that moment as he struggled to determine what to say. I could see his sincerity and felt bad I had suspected him just because he was so busy yesterday preparing for this exact moment. All the pressure was on him, and it seemed unfair. "We are suspicious there was sabotage," he responded lamely, seeming to guess the follow-up question. "What proof do you have of that?" "Well, none so far, but—" There was a tap at the door. Everyone turned to look. Henry and James were standing outside the glass door and peering uncertainly into the room. Ezra and I moved to the side, allowing them to enter. Henry looked hurried and frazzled, and as bedraggled as Ezra had earlier that morning, and his cheerful demeanor was much crushed. The two men stood just inside the room, looking not to Mr. Hunter or Dr. Vishwakarma, but to Ezra, and Ezra was looking expectantly at them. "Yeah, I got it," Henry said to Ezra, and then Ezra stepped forward, saying, "Actually, we do have evidence." "And who are you?" several voices asked. Mr. Hunter answered, "This is an acquaintance of mine, Mr. Lockwood. I've asked him to consult on this unbelievable incident. Please, Mr. Lockwood, go on." And he settled in to listen, a gleam in his eye of expectation. "Thank you, Mr. Hunter," Ezra said graciously, then turning to Dr. Vishwakarma, said, "Would you mind allowing James to run the display, Doctor?" After a glance to Mr. Hunter and the other owners, Dr. Vishwakarma stepped to the side. As James was getting things ready, Ezra said to the waiting crowd, "I am no one of any consequence, but I do have a little quirk of noticing things others do not. I would like to bring your attention to a few of those things which relate to the incident of the chemical reaction." The display changed from Dr. Vishwakarma's graphs and data to a paused recording of Dr. Blanchard as she entered her office. She was at this point nearest to the camera, for it was by the door. Ezra began explaining. "Now, James here has the timestamps, so we can move through this quickly. For I am hoping to be home by this afternoon. There is to be a presentation on dark matter matrices and pressure waves, which I am intent on seeing." I was astounded by the motion that this moment, which was so intense for me and no doubt the rest of the room, seemed rather boring to Ezra, and he was ready to move on to other things. But I have since learned it is really the way with him. Once the mystery is solved, even if he alone knows of the solution, it has lost his interest. Moving to stand before the display, Ezra pointed to the attractive woman shown in crisp, almost sharper-than-life quality above him. "This is Dr. Blanchard," he said casually. "She was the lead for this project, and as you can clearly see, she is wearing false nails." The image zoomed in so that the woman's fingernails were all in the shot and clearly visible. "False nails, as some of you may know," Ezra was saying drolly, "peaked in popularity some decades ago. After having reached quite an ostentatious and cumbersome apex, a more natural and subtle look has been the fashion for quite some time now. Such is the way of fashion and trends. Every generation must separate itself from its predecessor. I would like you to imagine how uncomfortable I felt with what was happening in that moment. Ezra was standing at the head of 10 or 12 important and successful people who no doubt had many calls on their time, and yet here he was talking about false nail fads. I searched for something I could say to stop Ezra's nonsense, lest we be expelled from the room by a mob of angry investors. Now, as you can see, though they are minimal, it is clear they are false. Ezra persisted. Next, James. The video jumped forward to the doctor sitting at her desk. Ezra went on. Here, you can see the doctor is carefully prying 2 of those false nails loose. Again, the shot zoomed in. There on the display, just visible below her monitor, were the fine, pale hands of Dr. Blanchard, and she could be seen prying at one of her false nails. I was stupefied. Maybe Ezra had something here. Why would she do that, I wondered. She had appeared to be working at the computer, but it was an act. She was staring forward but pulling at her nails. Why? Ezra explained. She does not remove them completely. They are loose but still attached. Next, please, James. Suddenly, the display showed the doctor at the rear of the lab pouring out a liquid into a small beaker. There, Ezra said and pointed to the beaker. The segment played again. There, he said once more. There what? Someone asked, and I think a sentiment everyone in the room felt. Again, James, Ezra said. Slow it down this time. The frame rate was higher than I would have expected in a surveillance video, but so was the quality. They were indeed very serious about security at Naptu Industries. Several frames slowly moved forward until suddenly we all saw it. Dr. Blanchard had, undoubtedly, dropped something into the beaker. A small, almost translucent sliver of something. That was the first nail, Ezra told us. Next shot, James. Another close-up image showed Dr. Blanchard missing one fingernail. One could barely tell, her real nails only slightly shorter than the false ones. I was shocked. Had she done it? I never thought it was her. I had never suspected her. Next, Ezra called out. A different camera, a different part of the lab. The doctor was pouring out the second component into a different flask. Another slow playback showed another sliver of something being dropped in. Another separate shot showed the doctor now with 2 missing nails. The false nails were transparent. It was the sheen and the length alone that showed them to be imposters. I wonder how Ezra could have seen the difference. Now we are going to jump back to the office, Ezra announced. The display showed Dr. Blanchard again, seated at her desk. She was applying lotion. This is before she loosed her false nails, Ezra was saying. The doctor is here applying a lotion. Notice how thick it is and how she applies it really only to her face, and is very particular, even getting her eyelids. I don't know about you all, but I have never in my life seen a woman concerned about eyelid moisturizing. How did I miss that? I wondered. It was very fast, but she no doubt swabbed her eyelids. How bizarre, I thought. But then I suddenly knew why, and I wondered which had Ezra seen first, the eyelid swabbing or the false nail removal. Ezra told James to go forward again. And now, thoroughly coated in her own personally mixed burn protectant, wearing a thick long-sleeved shirt, though it is nearly 90 degrees outside, white coat on, glasses on, and beakers ready, one on the lab bench far from where she had taken it from the tank, but right next to a sink, the other in her right hand, her body nearly as far from the lab bench as possible, Dr. Blanchard pours the 2 together, and, slow it down, James, she turns her face and leans back, and braces for the reaction, a fraction of a second before it happens. I am certain Dr. Blanchard is disappointed she couldn't have better controlled herself here. We all see it. She clearly flinches, and then the explosion lights up the image. She knew. Amazing, I thought. She already knew. She knowingly did this. The room was, like me, stunned to silence at what we had seen, at what we were still seeing. She dumped the evidence down the drain, poured water on it to better burn it up, and then unloaded an entire chemical fire extinguisher on a tiny little reaction that would have quickly put itself out. Nobody knew what to say. We watched her crawl up and cry, and I wondered, why is she crying? She knew this would happen. She planned it down to the very last step. And then I thought of Mr. Blanchard, Auréli's ex-husband. What was her life really like? What was it to be married to a man on whom you depended so much for the things you loved, for the activities you loved doing? What would she put up with? What behavior would she ignore? Was there love, or was it only sad nights crying like this, hopeless and miserable? Did her depression precede the incident? In a blast, the questions erupted from nearly every mouth in the room. Where was Dr. Blanchard? How had she done this? Why had she done this? Someone mentioned the recruiter. Someone mentioned being paid off. Ezra stepped forward again and began talking without preamble, and the voices immediately fell and listened, wondering what more knowledge this great wizard would share with them. Dr. Blanchard is gone, he said absolutely. I doubt anyone will ever see her in the States again. I saw the truth in his words. I saw her face again looking out of the window of her apartment. Even as we sat with her yesterday, she was thinking of her flight, of her escape. I have a little more than just this flimsy evidence, Ezra said, motioning to Henry. As Henry came forward, Ezra went on. Henry and I waited outside the apartment of Dr. Blanchard until it was late enough I felt we could confidently dig through her trash. After some hour or two of searching, Henry and I found such things as I suspected. What were those things? To explain, I must go back. Yesterday afternoon, I had returned to the facility and asked around if Dr. Blanchard had spoken recently to a computer chemist about designing a new material. The computer chemist head had directed me to a new tech, Cohen's, who had not but 2 months ago begun a rush project at the request of Dr. Blanchard. She had asked him to design something reactive, explosive even, that was safe when hardened, and yet when added to any of a list of chemicals, all of which are in this mixture, Ezra waved at the T-112 on the table, would become instantly unstable, and when the two were combined, would explode. An odd request, you might say, but that's precisely his job. Not to mention, Cohen's was new and looking to prove himself, and Dr. Blanchard is pretty and can be coercive. Working diligently together, the two finalized a material only a few days ago. Now, armed with a recipe for her fingernail explosives, Dr. Blanchard set to making them, stealing from Naptu any of the ingredients she could not acquire elsewhere. But as the materials are spread throughout the facility, and no one would question a request from Dr. Blanchard, this was easily done. Now, back to the dumpster. Henry and I did find remnants of these chemicals, as well as beakers, bottles, and molds. All of this we gathered up, and Henry has been running tests to see if the chemicals in our trash harvest are the source of the explosion, and he has confirmed they are. Henry nodded, holding the data he clutched in his hands, saying, "That's right. Ezra and I found everything I would deem necessary, and my tests show these chemicals could indeed do this and match those that Cohen's and Aurélie had created. But there's something else. As we were waiting to go dumpster diving, we saw Aurélie come down. She packed up her car with a couple of bags and left. It was the middle of the night. I wanted to go after her, but Ezra said it wouldn't matter. We couldn't legally stop her from leaving, and we couldn't convince her to stay. I told him I thought I could, so he said to call her. I did. She picked up and started crying. I asked her what she was doing, and she just started saying goodbye and how good of a scientist I was and to not let them take advantage of me. Don't waste your life with them, she said. I asked her where she was going, and she said to the water. That was it. She hung up. I felt sorry for Henry. He looked like this hit him hard. Ezra was moving toward me. The room was a commotion of talking and people standing. Come, Ezra said and walked out of the door. I followed him dumbly. How did you? I fumbled out. But a voice called to us. A man, one of the people from among the developers, was walking toward us. I'm very impressed, he was saying. and held out his hand to Ezra and me. I felt foolish receiving his admiration. I had done nothing. That was something else, he said. Ezra only nodded. An uncomfortable moment crawled by, and the man, seeing Ezra had nothing to say himself, went on. I'm Atlas Dakar. I am creating quite a project, a world-changing project, I think. And if I'm not mistaken, this isn't the last time I'm going to run into this kind of difficulty. There's a lot of money to be made and a lot of money to be lost, and that can cause people to do some crazy things. I think sadness makes people do pretty crazy things, Ezra said flatly. The man was silent as that sentiment settled in. Very true, he said eventually. And there might be some of that too. Sometimes bitterness costs more than dollars. There was another moment of silence before Mr. Dakar continued. Can I contact you if a little problem such as this one comes up again, whether within my group or an associate? So often our little troubles aren't a matter for the public or police, such as Dr. Blanchard here. I don't think they want to track her down. It seems to me she was unhappy and did a deal to get out of her situation. It would cost more lawyers and private detectives and public image to sue the competitor than it's worth, I'm sure. Sometimes it's just knowledge we need so we can move on, you know? Ezra nodded and said, Sure, you can contact me. If the problem is interesting, I might have a look if I have time. Of course, Mr. Dakar said smoothly. And you will be well remunerated for any consultation as well. Within the hour, we were on our plane again. Mr. Hunter hadn't come with us. He would have to stay another day or so and make sure all was right. As I sat there sailing through the blue sky, I couldn't help asking Ezra, When did you suspect her? I never suspected her, he answered. I only found more and more evidence proving it was her until it was irrefutable. Had I suspected anyone, I would have been biased. Bias can lead you anywhere. Your bias never allowed you to suspect the injured, sad doctor. Then why did you focus on her then? Because she was where it happened. But what if she hadn't been involved? There would have not have been any evidence suggesting she was. I was baffled. I felt the reasoning was circular. Well, what was the first bit of evidence then? I asked. I already told you, she was the one in the lab, Ezra said. She was the one in the best, really the only position to be able to modify the components that she alone would be mixing. She didn't want to contaminate the whole batch, John. She didn't want to hurt anyone else. She wanted to make a scene. She wanted to hurt herself. She had been coerced to cast doubt on T-112, but she had too much pride to ruin it entirely. It was her creation, after all. How simple, I found myself saying to my own surprise. It couldn't have been anyone else. Precisely, Ezra confirmed. But how in the world did you see her drop the false nails in? You had to zoom in and point it to us for us to see that. I didn't see it initially. James and I spent hours combing the footage to find that moment. I furrowed my brow. The explanation was becoming circular again. Then how did you know she had dropped him in the components? I didn't know. Then why did you look for them? He laughed at my frustration and explained, I looked for them because while everyone else was staring at her attractive face while at her desk, I was looking at her hands. You see, it was obvious to me she wasn't working. Her eyes weren't moving. They were staring blankly forward. She was thinking very hard, and pulling at her nails. I thought at first maybe it was a nervous habit, so I looked for them, in the trash, on the floor. It was possible they had been vacuumed up, but, though the site of the reaction had been cleaned, it seemed unlikely to me the whole office and lab would have been fully cleaned after an empty weekend. Also, when I saw she hadn't pulled them off entirely, it looked intentional. This, of course, was after the peculiar lotion application, which immediately caught my attention. So it was the lotion that tipped you off? I asked. No, nothing tipped me off. I simply continued to learn about the event. I thought for some moments about this, going through the whole series of interviews and experiences of the past 2 days. What about the snorkeling question? I asked, considering that awkward interaction. What did that have to do with anything? Ezra smirked and said, Nothing, really. That was more of a test. If Dr. Blanchard had done this intentionally, I decided she must have extreme self-possession and a cold control of her emotions. This was a long-played plan and required deceit, manipulation, and cunning. I wanted to see if I could break her facade, but as you saw. He didn't explain what I saw, for we both knew. She was a vessel about to blow, but she had somehow held it all in, at least for a little while longer. So that's what you were reading, I said after a few more minutes of consideration. You were reading about her. Yes, and about the possible competition. Of the companies hot on Naptu's heels, one of them has another lab in Cartagena, Colombia. If I were forced to guess, I would say that is where our lovely Dr. Aurélie Blanchard is now headed. Thank you for listening to the Atlantean Mysteries. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and consider sharing it with a friend and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more and to connect with this project, you can find us on most social platforms by searching for the Atlantean Mysteries and on our website www.theatlanteanmysteries.com. For information, suggestions, promotion, and reproduction, please send an email directly to hello@theatlanteanmysteries.com.